Hello, and thank you for joining us here at Ask a Historian. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. And first and foremost, Happy Canada Day. Today, joining us on this episode is local historian Richard Collins, and we'll explore some fascinating connections between Mississauga and the larger picture of Canadian history.
Well, thank you, Richard, once again joining us here at Ask a Historian. And here we are on Canada Day and exploring different connections of local history from Mississauga that connect to the bigger picture in terms of national history. And who better to bring onto the show today, Richard, than someone like yourself who transplanted from this community to Ottawa for a short period of time.
Yeah.
Tours in Ottawa, and I know from talking to you, always finding the Mississauga connection to some of the tours that you gave. So I figured what a natural link to explore some of those the personalities from this place that shaped the world beyond this place in terms of the Canadian story. So thank you, Richard, for spending some time with us here at Ask.
I'm glad to be back.
Always thrilled to have you on. Okay, so we're going to jump right into our topics today, and the first one on our list is Sir William Gage.
Yeah, one of my favorites because I knew him. I first knew him when I was still living in Gravenhurst, not in Ottawa. There's a couple of sanitariums, tuberculosis sanitariums that were built there in the 1920s before he died. So yeah, I was familiar with his name. That's where he's famous for having built some sanitariums because he wanted to be a doctor, but the story goes when he was first started taking medicine at U of T, he was queasy. He couldn't actually stand the idea of looking at open bodies and doing surgery and things like that. So he always had a fascination with helping out those in ill health, but knowing that he couldn't be a doctor, he spent his money on building a tuberculosis sanitarium. And it's how he got his money that I find interesting. If you look around your house, you'll probably find a red dictionary. If you're a good Canadian, you'll have a Canadian dictionary, not an American or a British dictionary. And if you do have a Canadian dictionary, it's probably a Gage Canadian dictionary. Gage is a publishing company still around today. The Gage Canadian Dictionary still gets published every year, and it's named after a Mississauga-born Sir William Gage, who was a publisher. And so that's why he's famous all around Canada, anyone in Canada, and a Gage Canadian Atlas. And that's important because you think, well, what's so big about having a Canadian dictionary? But our language is a little bit unique to either American English or British English. Sometimes we use British terms, other times we use American terms. And certainly with the atlases that were in schools at the time in the 1900s, 1910s, were usually coming over from the UK. And naturally they had maps of Britain and then smaller maps of the rest of the world. And the maps of the world were very colonial British. And so Sir William thought, well, we need a Canadian atlas that shows our provinces and the major cities of Canada rather than Canadian students reading British atlases and using British or worse yet, American dictionaries and spelling words like civilized with a Z rather than with the proper S, and horrible things like that. And so, yeah, he took it upon himself to have Canadian dictionaries and atlases in schools all across Canada. And as far as I know, they're still there, the Gage Canadian dictionaries.
Incredible. And you think about it, this fellow who had this impact across the country, educationally, but also through the tuberculosis sanatoriums. But born here in historic Mississauga, what was then Toronto Township, and
in Palestine.
Palestine, yes, indeed, in Palestine. And the same family has connections, of course, up in Brampton and Gage.
He was a teacher in Malton for a while at the Malton School. He started his education career in Mississauga. Wasn't there long before he got into publishing.
But you think of these people that we're talking to. All the ones we'll focus on today are sons and daughters of this place. But perhaps we started off with the one who had the broadest impact across the country, just from the publishing perspective and the education of children, is quite remarkable. So that's a brief.
Canadian. That's the thing I liked about him. He wanted to make sure there was a Canadian angle to education, and for the most part, that wasn't. We were considered a very British colony, even though we supposedly got our Confederation in 1867. We were still very British in the minds of a lot of people.
Yeah.
And Sir William Gage was one of those people, one of the first Canadians, in the sense that, yeah, I'm a British subject, but I'm Canadian, and I want students to know they're Canadian.
I know in the past we had an actor portraying William Gage at one of our events, and there was a line that was drawn. I always think about it when I think of William Gage, and or a line that was said, and somebody said something about British and colonial textbooks, and the response was, "We'll see about that."
That's true. I do remember that now. That was at Dixie Union Cemetery, wasn't it?
Right.
Yeah, which now brings up another point that I'd forgotten about until you mentioned that, because the stone gates that lined the Dundas Street elevation of the cemetery, those were gates that were donated to the community and to the cemetery by Sir William Gage.
Yeah.
So yeah, a physical reminder of his brief period in Mississauga. Is his family, I guess, are parents buried there?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, the elder Gages are buried there.
Yeah. But yes, no, just remarkable these little bits of our history that peek through about people who once lived in this place and marked this terrain as a place they were born, but went on to bigger and brighter things.
Yeah.
So the next person in our list here to talk about is as much a person as it is a symbol. And the symbol being, of course, our national flag. And we're going to talk about Robert Grievin. And you uncovered this story. I will say this was all of you. This was all you. And
well, there had been rumors in the past. So I think I'm the one who confirmed that the rumors were true.
Well, you take it away. Take it away.
Well, I guess the story of Robert Grievin, you might not know him, but if you're familiar with the Canadian flag, which I hope we all are, he's not the man who designed it, but he was a very important part of the history of the Canadian flag. I had heard stories that the very first flag to be raised on the Peace Tower on February 14th, 1965. I got the year right on that.
15th, I believe.
Yes. Oh, yeah, 15th. Yeah. Yeah, Hazel's birthday is the 14th. So this is the 15th of February. So I knew I had that date in my head. And I'd also heard rumors that the very first flag that had flown was made in Mississauga. And there was an article in the newspaper that one of our Mississauga South members, Peter Dunker, had discovered years ago in the Globe and Mail, but it seemed kind of vague, and I thought, I wanted to get more clarification. So in my brief period when I was in Ottawa, I went to the National Museum of History across the river in Gatineau, big, beautiful museum. If you get a chance, absolutely go there. And there's this big, huge flag that's hanging on the wall, that's advertised as the very first flag to fly from the Peace Tower. Now you can't get up and see it, and you can't read the tags because it's protected. You can't get up to it and touch it. But I thought, oh, that reminds me, I got to check and see about whether that Mississauga story is true enough. So I managed to get in contact with someone at the Museum of History who says, well, we don't own the flag. It's on loan from the House of Commons. So she gave me the name of the curator of the archives of the House of Commons. And I said, can you look at the tags on there and see what's on there? And sure enough, she got back to me a few weeks later and said, yeah, there's two tags. One tag on the very first flag says Department of Public Works, and the second tag says Canadiana Textile Works. And I was thrilled about that because, yeah, that was the name of Robert Grievin's company. His building is on Rangeview Road. The building is still there. The business is no longer there because this is 1965, but the building is still on Rangeview Road. And yeah, sure enough, and the exciting part of that is recently I've been with a group that's trying to, and well, Matthew, you've been part of this too, that's trying to promote Lakeview's history and about how Lakeview's forgotten history. And so I was telling this group, well, isn't that great? The very first flag to fly from Peace Tower was made in Lakeview, which it was. However, the tag reads Canadiana Textile Print Works, Port Credit. And that's because at the time, people in Lakeview had the luxury of door-to-door mail service, but because their mail was sorted at the Port Credit Post Office, it's frustrating to think that a Lakeview's contribution to Canada's history actually has Port Credit written on the tag. But so one way or another, it is a Mississauga story. And I was thrilled about that because, yeah, there was another bit of a controversy because it turns out there were two flags that day. One of them was Sheila Copps. You might remember her. She was a member of Parliament, and the Copps are a prominent family in Hamilton. And she claimed, no, I've got the first flag. It turns out she's right. She does have one of the first flags. On the day that the first flag was raised, the problem is the Peace Tower is way, way up there. And the photographer said, we can't take good photographs of this flag flying way up in the Peace Tower, especially when all the politicians are there that pay to shake hands and tell us how wonderful all the work they did on getting this flag. And so there was a second flag that was on a dais that was right at the front of the Peace Tower where all the politicians were. So there were two flags that day. One of them was from another company in Peterborough, the one that flew the dais. But we can say, that's not the real first flag, because that's the one that got photographed a lot that day. But the one that actually flew at the top of the Peace Tower that first day was made in Mississauga.
But it has a neat story, if I recall. It ended up in, I believe, Portugal at one point.
Yes, a lot of confusion as to who was supposed to get the flag. This is the way the government works. It got flown that day. They realized this is an historic piece of history because it's the first flag to fly from the Peace Tower of our brand new flag replacing the red ensign. But no one really seemed to know who was going to take responsibility for it. And so that after the ceremony, it was the Speaker of the House, which is why the House of Commons still officially has the flag as part of their collection. Lamoureux's his last name. I wish I could think of his first name. But he was the Speaker of the House. So he took it, not to steal it or anything, thought, I'm going to make sure this gets preserved. But for whatever reason, he kept it, thinking eventually there's going to be a museum where this can be flown. And now that's where the flag is, at the Museum of History in Gatineau. But the museum hadn't been built yet, so he says, I'm going to keep it in the meantime until it can be properly displayed. Well, in the intervening years, he became the ambassador to Portugal. And so he took all his belongings with him. And when he died, it was his wife who went through all his collection and realized, here's this Canadian flag in Lisbon. What's that doing here? And she traced the history, and then she donated it back to the House of Commons and says, my husband wanted this to go in a museum. Now that the museum has been built, get it there. So, so then it was found after being lost in Lisbon.
And I believe his name was Lucien Lamoureux.
Lucien, that's it, yes.
So a long traveled story, made in Lakeview, flown at the Peace Tower, retired in Lisbon.
Yes,
and now
you've been credited as having been made in Port Credit. So our Lakeview friends are going to have to make sure that that's corrected.
Well, I was going to say, and leave it to a Port Credit-based historian to uncover the fact that Lakeview's got a story in here.
Yeah.
So absolutely fascinating. And again, we think of those little connections. The first flag to be officially flown on the Peace Tower to unveil the new flag of Canada, February 15th of 1965, was made right here in Mississauga. Mm-hmm. We're going to jump now to a different theme, and probably a name a lot of people have heard of, but may have forgotten why, and has a definite Mississauga connection, although after the moments perhaps that made him most famous. But that is the name of Igor Gouzenko. Long story short, I'll let you jump into the story, but he did indeed live in Mississauga for a relatively short period of time.
Most of his life, the longest period.
The last part of his life. So if you can walk us through our connection to this moment in history.
Yeah, this is another Ottawa story. I'm lucky I spent 3 years in Ottawa because I'm getting more great Mississauga stories after I've been there again with the first flag to fly from the Peace Tower. Of course, Igor Gouzenko was working at the Soviet embassy at the end of the Second World War. And if you don't know who that is, the basic story, we'll do the Ottawa part of the story first before we get to Mississauga, because the reason he's in Mississauga is because he was hiding, the RCMP was hiding him from who I don't know. But he was a cipher clerk, which means even at the time, even though it's an embassy in Ottawa, the Canadian embassy for the Soviet Union, messages were being sent in code. This is how much tension was going on between the Soviet Union and Canada, the United States, and other Western nations at the time, that even things that were sent to the Canadian embassy were sent in code. He was the cipher clerk. His job was to decode these secret scrambled messages and translate them into Russian so that they could be reported. So he knew everything that was all the secret details of what was going on at the Russian embassy, because he was the translator. And he realized that there were, in these documents, there was indications that were spies all across Canada, a lot of them, of course, in Ottawa at the time, in the military. And as a Russian citizen, because when you're working at the ambassador's office, even though he's living in Canada, he's a Russian national. but he decided this was right. I need to report this to the RCMP. And so in 1945, I believe just at the end of the war, he reported all these stories that he had been breaking the code on, and exposed to the RCMP that there's Russian spies all over Canada. You need to know this. And so they kind of rushed him away. He realized if this was still Russia and still Soviet Union, that would mean the death penalty for him. So he was going to be sent back to Russia for punishment. He escaped, and the RCMP gave him shelter in, of all places, Mississauga.
There's well-known pictures of him appearing on interviews and whatnot with a paper bag over.
The bag over. He was famous for that on Front Page Challenge. So the whole that show has been around that long.
So one of the interesting things we uncovered of his time here in Mississauga was he had a number of aliases, and some of which were RCMP-based references, and some of which were the names that he was known by locally, because he lived in the community just outside of Streetsville. And
at one point I think he lived on Mississauga Road.
Yep.
Because John Wilson, another one of a past president of the Mississauga Historical Society, went to school with the two kids with the last name Krizak.
Yep.
And he's not too sure which house it is. I'm going to give the RCMP credit to this day. I found out very easily where his house is in Ottawa, because there's a big plaque at the park across the street saying, here's where Ego and Svetlana Guzenko lived when he was a cipher clerk. Still not too sure exactly which house on Mississauga Road. John's kind of got it narrowed down to 3 or 4 along Mississauga Road, across the street from what used to be Oak Ridge Farms, now a convent, Holy Name School. But which one it is to this day, I'm not sure. So I can say the RCMP did a good job. I heard he'd lived near Clarkson, he'd lived near Streetsville, but I think that was the RCMP providing, unless they moved him around.
They did move him around. That was something that we found. They moved him around, and the names changed when they moved. So I think this was part of the hiding of him. So the John Wilson, and your memory's right. I mean, Krizak was one of the names. Stanley Krizak was an alias.
And that's for the kids. His kids, when they went to school, at Port Credit Secondary under that name.
The first move we understood, now this may not be entirely accurate, but we understood it is when the kids were older and had begun to move on their own, because at that point the kids were kind of allowed to progress in their own lives. Was Clark and Anna Corby, which was his wife's alias at the time. That was down in the Clarkson area, and then later was in Streetsville, and he went by the name of Richard Brown. So that was and there were those in the Streetsville area that knew Mr. and Mrs. Brown.
Probably didn't sound like a Richard Brown. He probably sounded with that Russian accent.
But again, credit to the RCMP. They probably did a very decent job of hiding him, not only moving him, but changing the names. And
if he does have houses in Clarkson and Streetsville, I don't know where they are.
Yeah.
And I say, even the one in Mississauga, John's got vague recollections as to which one of 3 or 4 houses it might be. So good job to the RCMP. I'm gonna dare say
we don't. I'm gonna dare say we won't find his name on a property records.
No, or it's under assumed name. In fact, he was buried. When did he die? 1982, I think.
Yeah.
And he's buried at Spring Creek Cemetery, so he's still here. He's a permanent resting place in Mississauga. But he was buried, I think, under the name Krizak, but it might have been a different name at that time. But anyways, when his wife died, Svetlana, she died in 2001. I remember that because there was a ceremony at Spring Creek Cemetery in Clarkson when she was laid to rest, and she was buried with a tombstone that reads Guzenko.
Right.
And so at the same time, they changed his tombstone to one. It's actually a big boulder there with a plaque on it. But it wasn't until after Svetlana died that they felt maybe now it's safe to acknowledge who this man was. So as of 2001, his memorial boulder has a sign on that says Igor Guzenko.
The next one on our list to chat about, and a fellow who had long ties to this community, but also a significant impact on Canada during the First World War, and that was Lieutenant Colonel Agar Adamson, and this is the family that connects to the Adamson estate in Lakeview. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about Agar Adamson. The thing that I'm most amazed by with Agar, if you As far as I know, that I'm aware of, the largest funeral ever held in historic Mississauga was that of Agar Adamson in 1929, when he was laid to rest at Trinity Anglican Cemetery on Save Bank Road. And there's a video, a black and white grainy video on YouTube.
You can find it on YouTube.
Yeah, and you're just amazed at the sheer turnout of people for a this decorated officer's funeral in 1929, and it's an amazing thing to think of happening in this community, that sheer number of people for a funeral procession. So we'll run a link to that at the end as well. But I don't know if you can walk us through a brief story of Agar Adamson.
Yeah, well, almost to pick off where you were, where he was so well respected that at his funeral there were so many people there. Certainly, decades later in 2014, to honor the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the First World War and the creation of the PPCLI. We'll get to that in a minute. There was a marathon run across Canada to stop at significant points in the PPCLI's history. And they realized, well, one stop we definitely have to make is in Mississauga, because we want to present a plaque in the home where Agar and his wife Mabel Cawthra had lived. And that's, of course, the Adamson estate, a beautiful property that's managed by the city and by the Credit Valley Conservation Authority. So it's public land. I highly recommend anyone who's ever going down to the waterfront, if you live in Mississauga and you want to enjoy a waterfront, go down to the Adams Estate, beautiful gardens, and the lovely old house from 1919, 1920 is still standing. So it's a great piece of Mississauga architecture. But yeah, that brought that to mind that, in 2014, there was a procession of PPCLIers, including the Governor General at the time. Well, she wasn't the Governor General, she's former Governor General, but she is still the Colonel-in-Chief of the Princess Patricias Canadian Light Infantry, and that's Adrian Clarkson, another Mississauga kind of sounding name, but Clarkson. She unveiled a plaque there to Agar Adamson. But the story of the Princess Patricias Canadian Light Infantry is that when World War I first started, Canada had to take some time to get prepared. We didn't really have much militia. We had to kind of encourage people to sign. The British were ready to go much earlier because they had an organized army, and it was easier for them to send soldiers over in the early part of the First World War. But a Montreal textile merchant, Andrew Hamilton Gault, wanted to raise money, wanted to give some of the money to raise a battalion to send over. And the Princess Patricias Canadian Light Infantry was formed at that point, even before Canada had kind of gotten its act together. Gault had asked retired veterans of the Boer War, or just people in the militia at the time, to come and join his unit. He would pay for the uniforms and for the equipment that they needed, and ship them over. So they originally fought for about the first part of the war with the British Expeditionary Force, even though they were Canadian. And then when the CEF, the Canadian Expeditionary Force, got organized around 1915, the Princess Patricia herself, the daughter of the Governor General, said, I think it's appropriate that we should have a Canadian commander of this British force, because it is now being moved back over to the CEF, and it's all Canadians. And a little bit more Ottawa. I'll shut up about Ottawa soon because I'm back in Mississauga. But happened to be living in Ottawa at the time, which was the place to be if you're looking for political appointments, of course, was Agar Adamson, who was a clerk at the Senate Library, and with some connections with the Masterson family. And he had served in the Boer War and was still a militia officer with the Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa. And so they offered him the post as the commander of the PPCLI. So he commanded the PPCLI for the rest of the war through Vimy Ridge and through that last 100 days as they pushed back through Germany. So yeah, a Canadian, a Mississaugan, who you can read a lot about whenever you read about the history of the First World War in Canada. Certainly Agar's name pops up.
And there's a fabulous book written or collected on his letters of Agar Adamson, on letters that he had written home to or written to his wife Mabel during the war. And that's a fantastic resource of Canadian experience during the First World War. But again, highly
He's mentioned an awful lot, as just while you're mentioning that, another book called Canada's 100 Days. He's mentioned a lot in there, and we'll talk more about that because that's written by JFB Livesay, and we're going to talk about Livesays in a minute, although a different Livesay. But he was with the Canada Press at the time, and highly praised Agar Adamson. And Mabel Cawthron didn't get the recognition she deserved. I want to mention her too because the Cawthrons have been in Mississauga forever, since the early 1800s. And it was on her land when Agar married Mabel. It was on Cawthron property that the Adamson estate is standing on now. And I think the architecture is very much her. She was an interior designer, but she did go to Belgium. For the last couple of years of the war, she wanted to be with Agar. And obviously she couldn't fight in World War I. Women weren't allowed in combat, but she was a nurse in Belgium. And so if you look at the house today, you see a lot of that Flemish Belgian influence on the architecture of the home. So she deserves some credit too, Mabel.
Absolutely. Well, let's do that. Let's make that the segue to the next person and Livesay into our connections to Dorothy Livesay. But maybe you can very briefly touch about the writing of the book by well, you said it was John Livesay, right?
Yeah, John Livesay, or Fred Livesay, JFB, John Frederick Bly, I love that name, Bly Livesay, who was originally from Winnipeg, and he met his wife Florence there. They were both journalists for the Winnipeg Free Press, but they married there, and he eventually formed something called Canada Press, which is still around today. If you're looking at newspapers and you see, a headline and it'll say, wherever in brackets, it'll say CP, that means Canadian Press, which during the First World War, a lot of small newspapers couldn't afford to send correspondents to Europe to keep track of what the local soldiers were doing. And so small towns were kind of worried that, hey, we're not going to get news about how our boys are doing, whether they've been injured or whether they've done something heroic. And so he and a bunch of other people decided to create a national news service called Canadian Press, which just covered all of Canada's military operations, what Canadian battalions and regiments were doing during the war. And that gave these small towns an opportunity to be able to get access to news on local boys that were over there that otherwise couldn't afford it. And that eventually led into what is still the modern day press agency that's around. So that was Fred's contribution, and Florence Livesay. But I think most notable as far as being an important Canadian is their daughter, Dorothy Livesay, who I think is a wonderful Mississaugan that we don't know much about, and I think we should. They moved from Toronto in 1924 out to Clarkson. Their house is still standing in Clarkson. So the historic building Woodlot is still occupied. And it was there that Dorothy started writing a lot of poetry, but sometimes quite controversial poetry. She would write about spousal abuse and abuse of women. And this is the 1920s and 1930s when poets didn't write about these kind of things, and it made a lot of people uncomfortable. But this is the kind of person Dorothy was. She wanted to get these kind of stories out there about the kind of things that didn't get talked about. And so she was quite controversial that way. And in the 1960s, she went to what was called Northern Rhodesia. I think it's Zambia now, but Northern Rhodesia at the time. And she became a school teacher there. She wanted to teach people in Africa and give them an education, give them an opportunity for jobs. So a really great Canadian that way. Also at one point, when I was doing some research here, I found out she was the publisher of a newspaper called The New Frontier. So I got online to find out more about The New Frontier and discovered, probably much to her father's chagrin, because he was a very proud British Canadian, that The New Frontier was the Communist Manifesto in Canada at the time. So she was very much into socialism and equal rights for people. But at the time, again, quite controversial in the 1930s and 1940s to be part of the communist movement. But that didn't deter Dorothy. So I think she's a wonderful person that we should know about because of her contribution. And then finally, in 1987, in recognition of all her unique way of presenting uncomfortable topics, but getting them into the forefront, she was awarded the Order of Canada. And
again, a Mississauga resident for a period of time. So.
Living in Clarkson.
Let's keep within the literary world here. We go from Dorothy Livesay and her father before her, but another Clarkson figure from a literary perspective is there's something about Clarkson, maybe I'm not sure, but the famed Maison de la Roche, that even in this day and age, one of the most well-known Canadian authors in history.
Yeah, right across the street. She lived in Trail Cottage, which is across the street from the woodlot, which is still standing. So yeah, Dorothy and Maison knew each other. They were friends, and it makes me wonder how much of an influence the two of them were on each other. Very different writers, though, because while Dorothy was quite openly controversial about the things she wrote about, Maison was very comfortable with this old British tradition of Canadians living in all of British heritage and living in mansions. And of course, as you may know, she wrote a series of romance novels about a fictional family called the White Oaks. And of course, there's a neighborhood in Clarkson that's called the White Oaks neighborhood, named after her, as well as a couple of streets. There's a street called Jalna Street, which is named after the fictional mansion that the White Oaks family lived in. And yeah, so she wrote these novels that were very popular in the UK, even more so than Canada at the time, because I think British kind of like to read about exotic places, and Canada was an exotic place at the time. And they pictured Canada as this idealized place where the British gentry still lived the old lifestyle, when of course at the time, 1920s, 1930s, when she's writing her novels, we're very much an industrialized country. We're a very independent country now. We're much more Canadian than we are British. So I think the British respected Maison more than Canadians did at the time. She spent most of her career in Canada, not that well known. I think she's much better known now than she was at the time. And I like to think that maybe Benares Historic House, which is one of Mississauga's museums, is at least partly responsible for that, because it's a public museum, open, or soon after COVID will be opening into the public, where Maison didn't live, but she knew the Harris family, and she was very much inspired by the Harris family, because a lot of the White Oaks characters, Captain White Oak was a retired British officer, as was James Harris, the man who built Benares. Similar connections like that. You had one lady, the lady that actually donated the house in the city of Mississauga, Naomi Harris, was single, but a very attractive woman. And sure enough, there was a character, Meg White Oak, who Maison describes as being a beautiful woman, but never married. So clearly a connection to Naomi. And so she knew the Harris family well and was very much inspired to, and Jalna itself, the name of Jalna is a city in India. And she picked up that name because she knew that Benares, where her friends, the Harrises, lived, is also named after an ancient city in India, Varanasi. And so, yeah, that's why I think she's well known now, because of her romance novels are quite trashy and quite wonderful to read.
And the plaque commemorating her from the Historic Sites Board for Parks Canada is at Benares Historic House as well.
Yeah, which is nice because again, yeah, there was the Harris family and the Sayers, the third and fourth generation. At some points, they kind of denied it, and there have been many authors. It's been quite a controversy. It's seen sometimes of 4 or 5 good biographies written about Maison de la Roche, but one of the big controversies is Benares Jalna. Benares seems to get as much press as Maison does in these biographies. But then Maison's adopted daughter, Esby, about 10, maybe 15 years ago now, donated a whole pile of her mother's diaries to Benares, which was kind of an acknowledgement from the next generation of the De La Roche family that, yes, we feel this connection between our family and the Harrises. And so, yeah, and it was just a year after that the national plaque of all places, even though she was born in Newmarket, and there's a couple of houses she lived in Newmarket that are still standing. There's a Sovereign House in Oakville, which is a museum that's still standing. She lived in Sovereign House for a while. But they decided the best place to put the historic plaque was in Clarkson.
Yeah. So there's always that strong connection, like you said, between the family and the property, and the fact that Maison lived nearby when she was creating this world and these characters. And there certainly seems to be some very strong links when you look at the family history and the property history to the stories that Maison crafted.
And you did mention something about Clarkson too. Why is it we all see? Why did the live states and the Clarksons end up in Clarkson? It's not a coincidence. Again, that goes back to the Harrises. They had a huge property, but there was only about 6 acres left, but it was 285 acres at one point. It was a huge farm. And when one of the daughters, Annie, got married, Naomi's older sister, when she got married, she got the southern half of the property, 150 acres, a nice wedding gift. But they started to subdivide it in the 1920s with the intention is that they wanted to make it kind of an exclusive, kind of a writer's neighborhood where people could kind of escape the busy Toronto area and come out into the peaceful ideal of nearby Toronto and kind of maybe this peaceful setting would inspire. And certainly it worked for Mazo and it worked for Dorothy too. A lot of early poetry was written in Clarkson, and at least the first 4 or 5 of Mazo's 12 novels on the way up Sujalna were written while she was living in Clarkson.
Oh, it's just incredible. So from that, we're going to jump to a little bit more modern academic connection from Mississauga to the bigger picture and of Canadian identity and Canadian history, and that being John, better known as Twozo Wilson. And wondering if you can walk us through the story of Twozo.
Twozo, yeah, everyone calls him Twozo. I remember when I was in high school in Rhodesia as a kid, and this is 1970s when John Twozo Wilson was famous, and we'll explain why in a minute. But he was a very important part of any geography class in Canada at the time. And I always remember in high school that if you were stuck for an answer for a question like, what's the capital of New Brunswick? You'd always write Twozo as your answer. Name the hurricane that swept through in southern Ontario 1904. I don't remember. It must have been Hurricane Twozo. It was just kind of a joke. You would stick with the name Twozo. The reason he was known by that name, even though he's John Wilson, his middle name was Twozo because his mother's maiden name was Twozo. And she was a great influence on John Twozo Wilson because she was a mountain climber and a mountaineer. Again, another woman who was doing things that women didn't do in the 1920s. She was climbing mountains. She was putting on all this gear. Mountaineering was very much a man's hobby in the 1920s, but she decided she was going to do it. She loved doing it. And when she had John, her son, she instilled a passion in geology in her son. And what he did with that passion of geology is he came up with a theory of plate tectonics. For most of our history, we assume when you look at a map of the Earth has always looked the way it looks, with the continents shaped the way they are. And he had shown that the continents were floating on these tectonic plates. This was quite revolutionary at the time. It had been theorized by people prior to Twozo, but he was the one that figured out the mechanics and figured out the rate at which literally at the bottom of the Atlantic was spreading, and consequently the continents were moving, and at the other end on the Pacific side, all these rocks were being pushed back down into the earth where it's hot and being melted down and being spit up volcanoes as new rocks. and people never think of rocks as being things that have life cycles, that born and live and die. But yeah, it was Twozo that figured this out. But the Mississauga, the Ottawa connection, he did live in Ottawa, my last name, Ottawa, because he did live in Ottawa at the time, because his father was with the Royal Navy at the time. But because of his fame in the 1970s, well, actually before that, he'd already been a well-known geologist before he came up with plate tectonics, but he was invited to become the first principal of what was called Arundel College. And you say, where the heck is Arundel College? Well, that's UTM now. It always was part of the University of Toronto, but it had a name. So from 1967 to 1974, John Twozo Wilson was the principal of UTM.
And just made some astounding connections to ideas that really shaped the world's perspective on continents, continental drift, plate tectonics, geological forces that were at work, earthquakes and the like, and really his perspectives, his findings shaped that academic study. So our final person that we're going to talk about today, and this list could go on, and I realize that, but the final one, we're going to go further back into our history, and we're going to look at an incredible story of an Indigenous woman who was born along the banks of the Credit River at the Credit Mission Village in what is now Mississauga. That is Nane.
Nani
Better known as Professor Donald Smith refers to her as Nane, and I appreciate that. Nane Bawikwe, also known by her Anglican name or anglicized name of Catherine Sutton. Wondering if you can walk us through Nane's story.
Yeah, well, I guess the most important part of her story this time takes place in Owen Sound in that area. But she was born in the Credit Reserve, so she's literally a Mississauga native, unlike the others that have lived here. But she was part of the Mississauga Nation. But it's when she married a Methodist minister. A lot of Methodist influence in Port Credit with the Mississauga Nation at the time. Richard Ryerson, Peter Jones, well-known people in Canadian history, and certainly in Mississauga's history. They were Methodist ministers that converted a lot of the people of the Mississauga Nation and the Credit Mississaugas in particular to the faith. And she married, I forget his first name now, but he was Sutton. Maybe you can help me with the first name there, because I know her more than I know her husband. He was a Methodist minister, and of course, typical of the time, the Methodists were saddleback preachers. Yep. They were constantly moved around to preach the gospel and to convert a lot of the Anishinaabe people to the faith. And it was when they got married, they had a farm on reserve lands in Owen Sound. So they even though he was a Methodist minister, he lived on the reserve lands in Owen Sound. But they kept moving around, and so they left Owen Sound area in the 1940s. While he did his tour, his mission. And when they came back, they found that the land had been sold by the government because it was reserve land. So the individual people that lived on the land legally didn't have the right to maintain their land, and it got sold in a negotiation without Nane, we'll call her, without her being there at the time. And so when she got back, she was shocked at this. And again, another in the same vein as Dorothy Livesay and Mabel Cothra, women that were, and Henrietta Twozo, women that were doing the kind of things that women just didn't do at that time. She stood her ground and said, I think we deserve the right to be able to have the rights to our land, and we should be able to obtain our land back. And I guess she must have been a very convincing, she must have been a persuasive person, because she managed to convince the Methodist Church to raise money to send her to London to meet with the Colonial Office, which handled the affairs of the Indian Department at the time. And the head of the Colonial Office was so taken by her confidence and her certitude that he thought it was a good idea to arrange a meeting with, of all people, the Queen. I said, I think Queen Victoria would really love to meet this lady. And sure enough, he arranged a meeting with so that Nane could meet with Queen Victoria in 1860, I believe. And again, she must have been very persuasive with Her Majesty, because eventually Her Majesty, pretty much of her own authority, decided that no, Nane and her husband should have their land back. And they got different land than the one they had, but they still got land, and they got ownership of the land, which is unusual at the time. So yeah, that was her amazing contribution. And I think that kind of set the tone going for the Aboriginal communities going forward about fighting for their rights to the land, which of course goes even into the current day. So I think any of these people, that are Aboriginal people that are negotiating land treaties, they should think about Nane and what she did.
Well, absolutely. A person of great significance, not only in Indigenous people, but for Indigenous people, but also, in Canadian history, a great Canadian who aspired to right a wrong that took her abroad to, like you said, of all audiences, she achieves a personal audience with Queen Victoria. Now, I don't have a perfect knowledge of this process, but I believe from what we said that the first two Mississauga people to meet personally with a British monarch was Reverend Peter Jones in 1838 and Nane. And both of whom are indigenous Mississaugas. You have so you look at these moments. Yes, we talk about colonialism and indigenous peoples and the like, but you go right to the top in terms of who you're speaking to about the issues that are affecting you, and how many people today can think of, I'm going to go talk to the Queen, and here we are. We're very early on. We have two individuals from this area who make that arduous trip across the ocean and secure a personal audience with Queen Victoria. It is an amazing story.
Peter Jones apparently left a Katiwaquana. He left quite an impression on the Queen too.
Yeah, it's a personal entry in her diary, I believe. But we'll close on that as a perspective of looking at Mississauga's connections to a wider, bigger story of Canadian history, and there are many more, of course. But that's a brief look in respect to Canada Day and local history. So, Richard, thank you so much for joining us here at Ask a Historian.
Anytime, and happy Canada Day to everyone.
Thank you for spending some time with us here at Ask a Historian. And thank you to Richard Collins for sharing some of his knowledge of connecting Mississauga's history to the bigger Canadian picture. A fascinating way to reflect on Canada Day. Of course, we only scratched the surface of many of those important moments and people that are from this place that had impact beyond the borders of Mississauga. Some of the others that came to mind in our discussions were the Aikens, James Cox Aikens and Sir James Albert Manning Aikens, who born here locally with connections here in historic Mississauga, but rose to prominence in politics in Manitoba. Also in that mix, a similar lineage about being born in this community and roots here, but coming to prominence in the Canadian West, Sir James Alexander Lougheed. And of course, we haven't even touched on our own father of Confederation, Sir William Pierce Howland, who represented this community at the time of Canadian Confederation. And those, again, just scratching the surface. There are so many more people and moments that we could explore on. But first and foremost, to everyone watching, happy Canada Day, all the very best. And thank you for joining us here at Ask a Historian.